The banquet room breathed softly. Crystal glasses caught the light. Silverware rested untouched. Conversation stayed polite, measured, rehearsed. This was Harlem dressed for outsiders. Bumpy Johnson sat where he always did. Never at the center, never. Hidden, close enough to be seen, far enough to be left alone. His suit was dark, unremarkable. No jewelry, no display. Power didn't need decoration. Across the table, a politician laughed too easily. The kind of laugh meant to prove comfort, the kind men used when they believed the room belonged to them. He spoke about progress, about order, about how Harlem needed guidance. His words floated above the table like smoke, pleasant at first, then heavy. Someone near Bumpy stopped chewing. The politician's tone shifted, just slightly. A sentence stretched. Longer than it should have. A pause landed where it didn't belong. The threat didn't announce itself. It slipped in quietly, dressed as concern. A reminder of permits, a reminder of police presence, a reminder that influence could reach anywhere if it wanted to. Eyes moved without turning heads. A waiter froze mid-step. Chairs creaked as men adjusted their posture, instinctively creating space. Around Bumpy Johnson, like the air itself knew to pull back. Bumpy didn't look up. He folded his napkin once. Neat. Precise. He listened the way men do, when they already understand more than is being said. His face remained calm, unreadable, almost bored. The politician smiled, mistaking silence for submission. That was the mistake, because silence around Bumpy Johnson was never empty. It was crowded, with memory, with consequences, with the weight of things already decided. Harlem knew that sound, that quiet before judgment, before choice. Someone cleared their throat, hoping to break it. Another reached for a glass that didn't need refilling. No one spoke. No one interrupted. The threat finished its sentence and sat there, hanging in the air, waiting to be acknowledged. Bumpy Johnson finally raised his eyes. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough. The room leaned forward without realizing it. Nothing happened yet. No words, no motion, only a subtle shift, like gravity choosing a new direction. The banquet continued on paper. Plates were served. Smiles returned, where they were expected. But the shape of the room had changed. Everyone felt it. Whatever was said next, whenever it came, would not belong to the man in the suit across the table. It would belong to Bumpy Johnson. And Harlem was already listening. Harlem didn't belong to speeches. It belonged to memory. Outside the banquet hall, the streets carried a different rhythm. One. Built from favors remembered, debts forgiven, lines never crossed. Twice. That rhythm answered to Bumpy Johnson. He walked those blocks without escort, without announcement. Store. Owners nodded before he reached the door. Mothers lowered their voices when he passed, not from fear, but from trust. He kept things from spilling over. He kept boys alive long enough to become men. Power like that doesn't come from threats. It comes from consistency. Bumpy Johnson never promised protection out loud. He simply made sure trouble didn't linger. A dispute ended before it grew teeth. A reckless man disappeared from influence without disappearing from life. Harlem stayed standing while other neighborhoods burned themselves down. Inside the banquet, the politician believed authority came from titles, from offices downtown, from men with badges who didn't live where they worked. Bumpy knew better. Authority lived in who people called first, and who they didn't need to call at all. Word traveled faster than cars in Harlem. By the time dessert was served, the insult had already reached the barbershops. The back rooms. The stoops where men played cards and pretended not to listen. They didn't ask if Bumpy heard it. They asked what it meant. Because when someone disrespected Bumpy Johnson publicly, they weren't challenging a man. They were challenging a balance that kept the streets from tilting into chaos. And Harlem didn't tolerate that. Bumpy understood this responsibility the way other men understood. Hunger. He never confused respect with fear. Fear burned fast. Respect endured. At the banquet table, he spoke little. Let others fill the space. Let assumptions grow comfortable. He didn't need witnesses yet. He needed clarity. By the time the night ended, everyone had returned to their roles, politicians to their drivers, guests to their coats, waiters to their cleanup. Bumpy Johnson walked out last. Not because he had to, because he chose to. Outside, the city exhaled. Neon lights flickered. Harlem resumed its watchful calm. Somewhere, a man laughed too loudly. Somewhere else, someone whispered a warning. Bumpy adjusted his coat and stepped into the street. Whatever answer was coming wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be rushed, but it would remind everyone, politicians included, exactly who Harlem answered to. Pressure didn't come with fists this time. It arrived folded into letters, smiled through meetings, shook hands, firmly and held on a second too long. Men downtown started asking questions they already knew the answers. 2. Licenses stalled. Inspections multiplied. Police cars idled. Longer than usual on familiar corners. Engines running. Watching. Nothing in particular. That was the language being spoken now. The politician hadn't raised his voice at the banquet. But he'd been heard. And now the city responded the way it always did when power felt challenged. Quietly. Indirectly. With plausible deniability. Bumpy Johnson noticed everything. He noticed which patrol cars changed routes, which business owners were visited twice in 1 week, which men stopped returning calls, not out of fear, but instruction. Still, he didn't move. He sat in back rooms where the lights were low and the conversations shorter. He listened while others talked themselves into mistakes. He let pressure reveal its own shape. Because pressure always believed it was invisible. A younger man suggested action. A show of strength. A reminder. Bumpy silenced him with a look, not sharp, not angry. Disappointed. This isn't muscle, he said calmly. This is posture. And posture could be corrected. The politician believed the city could squeeze Harlem into compliance. That a few controlled inconveniences would force a reaction, force noise, force a mistake that could be pointed to later. Bumpy Johnson had survived men who thought louder things. He understood something they didn't. Power that needed to be proven was already slipping. So he waited. Let the pressure continue just long enough to be seen. Long enough for Harlem to feel it. Long enough for the community to recognize who was causing the imbalance. Only then did Bumpy begin to prepare, not for violence, but for exposure. Because when pressure wore a suit, the most dangerous response wasn't force, it was patience. And patience, in Harlem, had a way of making men nervous. The pressure stopped pretending to be subtle. A name was mentioned out loud, not shouted, not accused, just placed carefully into conversation, where it didn't belong. Bumpy Johnson. It happened in rooms where people leaned back in their chairs, confident, at fundraisers, at civic lunches, in conversations meant to travel. The politician let it be known, never directly, always. Safely, that Harlem's balance was temporary, conditional, replaceable. That was the real insult. Not the threat at the banquet, not the inspections, but the suggestion that order existed without consent. Harlem heard it the same way it heard everything, through glances, pauses, doors closing a little slower than usual. People didn't panic. They didn't riot. They watched. Because they knew Bumpy was watching too. He let the words circulate, let them gain weight, let the speaker grow comfortable repeating them. Public disrespect had a way of clarifying intention, of drawing clean lines. Bumpy spent his days as he always did, visiting storefronts, sitting quietly in back rooms, listening more than he spoke. To the city it looked like nothing was happening, but beneath that calm, calculation moved with precision. He mapped where the insult had landed. Who repeated it? Who benefited from it? He separated ego from influence, noise from leverage. This wasn't about pride. It was about precedent. If the insult stood unanswered, it wouldn't stop with him. It would move through Harlem like rot, teaching the wrong lesson, that respect could be negotiated from a distance. That couldn't happen. Still, Bumpy refused the obvious response. Violence would be expected. Confrontation would satisfy the wrong audience. He needed an answer that would land where words had landed, publicly, cleanly, and without blood. The city waited, not anxiously, respectfully. Because when Bumpy Johnson took his time, it meant the response would last longer than the insult. And somewhere downtown, a politician began to sense that silence. Wasn't submission at all. It was the sound of being measured. The answer didn't arrive with sirens. It didn't raise voices or close streets. It arrived on a morning that felt ordinary. The politician stepped into a room expecting control. Another meeting, another arrangement shaped in his favor. The faces around the table were familiar, friendly, comfortable, until they weren't. A document slid across the table, not aggressively, casually. The kind of movement that didn't demand attention, but commanded it. Anyway, it wasn't a threat. It wasn't an accusation. It was clarity. Permits already approved, without his signature. Committees, suddenly uninterested in his proposals. Support quietly withdrawn, not by enemies, but by people he believed were aligned with him. No one said Bumpy Johnson's name. They didn't have to. The politician realized in that moment that his pressure had been visible, that his words had traveled further than intended, that Harlem had responded, not emotionally, not violently, but administratively, socially, decisively. Power had moved around him while he was busy applying it. By the time he understood what had happened, it was complete. No appeal, no confrontation, just a new reality forming without his consent. Back in Harlem, the reaction was muted. No celebration, no gossip, just a quiet settling, like furniture returning to its rightful place. Bumpy Johnson didn't comment. He didn't explain. He didn't take credit. He sat where he always sat, calm as ever, letting the lesson speak for itself. Because domination, when done properly, didn't humiliate. It educated, and everyone, politicians included, understood exactly what had been taught. The city moved on the way cities always do, quickly, selectively, pretending nothing had changed. But Harlem remembered. Not the politician's name, not the meeting, not even the insult itself. What lasted was the feeling that followed, the certainty that balance had been restored without chaos. That power, when handled correctly, didn't need to announce itself. Storefronts stayed open, permits stopped stalling, police cars returned to their old routes, engines quiet again. The pressure lifted without explanation, the way it had arrived. People understood what that meant. Bumpy Johnson hadn't defended his ego. He'd defended a boundary. One that protected more than his own position. It protected the neighborhood from becoming a bargaining chip. Men talked about it years later, not with excitement, but with respect. They told it as a lesson, not a legend. How restraint carried more weight than violence, how silence could correct arrogance faster than bullets ever could. Bumpy never corrected the stories, never added detail. Legacy didn't need polish. He remained what he had always been, a steady presence, a measured force, a man who understood that power was temporary but reputation endured. Long after the banquet hall hosted new faces and new promises, Harlem still answered the same way it always had. Not to threats, not to titles, but to the man who proved, again, that true control didn't shout. It waited.